The storage room in the university's archives department smelled like dust and forgotten things. Dr. Abigail Foster had spent the past 3 hours sorting through boxes of donated materials from a recently deceased local historian. Most of it was unremarkable: town records, old newspapers, and faded photographs that would eventually be cataloged and filed away, likely never to be seen again. "I'm heading out, Abby," called her colleague from the doorway. "You sure you don't want to grab dinner?" Abigail waved without looking up. "I want to finish this box. There's always tomorrow." After the door closed, she sat back and rubbed her eyes. At 38, she'd spent nearly half her life in archives and libraries, studying history through fragments left behind. As the university's lead archivist specializing in early 20th century American photography, she had handled thousands of photographs, but something about the small collection in this particular donation had caught her attention. The photographs had belonged to a man named Thomas Whitaker, who had lived in this small Massachusetts town his entire life before passing away at 94. Among his possessions was a series of glass plate negatives and prints dating back to 1908, most showing unremarkable town scenes: a main street, a church picnic, children playing in a schoolyard. But one photograph stood apart. It showed a young boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, sitting stiffly in what appeared to be a photographer's studio. He wore a high-collared white shirt and dark jacket, his hair neatly parted to one side. His expression was solemn, as was common in photographs of that era when exposure times required subjects to hold still. In his hands he clutched a book. Something about his eyes unsettled Abigail. They seemed too intent, too aware, almost adult-like in their intensity. She slipped the photograph into a protective sleeve and set it aside. There was nothing particularly special about it, yet she felt drawn to it in a way she couldn't explain. The boy's gaze seemed to follow her as she moved around the room. "Stop being ridiculous," she muttered to herself. She finished sorting the contents of the box, locked up the archives, and headed home. That night, she dreamed of the boy with the book. In her dream, he stood at the foot of her bed, his eyes fixed on her face, his lips moving silently as if reciting something from memory. She woke with a start at 3:17 a.m., her heart racing, the image of the boy's face still vivid in her mind. The next morning, Abigail returned to the archives with dark circles under her eyes. She told herself she was being silly. She'd looked at thousands of old photographs over the years, many of them unsettling in their own way. This was just another one. Still, she found herself returning to that box, pulling out the photograph of the boy again. The label on the back, written in faded ink, simply read, "Edward, 1908. She decided to digitize it. The university had recently upgraded their digital imaging equipment, and Abigail spent the morning carefully scanning the photograph at an extremely high resolution. Once the image was uploaded to her computer, she began to examine it more closely, zooming in on different sections. The book the boy held appeared to be bound in dark leather. As she zoomed in further, she noticed something unusual about it. Unlike most books of that period, this one had no visible title on its cover. Instead, there appeared to be some kind of symbol embossed in the leather, a circle with what might have been a pattern inside, though it was difficult to make out clearly. Zooming in even further on the boy's hands, she noticed his knuckles were white with tension, as if he was gripping the book with unusual force. Was he nervous about being photographed? That would have been normal for the time. Yet something about the way he held it seemed almost protective. She zoomed in on his face next, studying his features. He had a small scar near his right eyebrow. His eyes were large and dark, his mouth set in a firm line. She was about to zoom out when she noticed something reflected in the boy's eyes. It was a common phenomenon in photography. Sometimes the photographer or the camera itself would be reflected in a subject's eyes if the light hit just right. But this reflection was odd. She increased the magnification and enhanced the contrast. There, in the reflection in the boy's right eye, was what appeared to be a tall, thin figure standing behind the camera. Not the photographer. This figure was too tall, too strangely proportioned to be a normal person, and it seemed to be wearing something dark that covered its face. Abigail sat back, a chill running down her spine. It was probably nothing, just a trick of the light or an imperfection in the photograph. Old photographs often had strange artifacts, especially those from glass plates. Still, She couldn't shake the feeling that she was looking at something that wasn't supposed to be there. Her phone rang, startling her so badly she nearly knocked over her coffee. "Archives Department, this is Abigail," she answered, trying to steady her voice. "Dr. Foster? This is Megan from the History Department. I wanted to follow up on that guest lecture for next week." Abigail had completely forgotten about the lecture she had agreed to give for Professor Reynolds's class on historical photography. "Yes, of course. I'll have the slides ready by Friday." After hanging up, she glanced back at her computer screen. The zoomed-in image of the boy's eye was still there, the strange reflection clearly visible. On impulse, she hit print and watched as the machine spit out an enlarged version of just that section of the photograph. Throughout the day, Abigail found her thoughts returning to the boy and the book. What was the symbol on the cover? Who was the strange figure reflected in his eye? She found herself wondering about Edward, the boy in the photograph. What had happened to him? Had he lived a long, ordinary life? Or had something else been in store for him? That evening, instead of heading home, she walked to the town's historical society. If anyone would have records about a boy named Edward from 1908, it would be them. The historical society was housed in an old Victorian mansion that had once belonged to one of the town's founding families. Sarah Jenkins, the elderly volunteer who typically staffed the front desk, greeted Abigail with a smile. "Dr. Foster, what brings you to our humble collection? University archives not enough for you today?" Abigail returned the smile. "Looking for some information on a local family, possibly from the early 1900s. I've got a photograph of a boy named Edward, dated 1908, but no last name." Sarah's smile faded slightly. "Not much to go on, is it? But let's see what we can find. We've got census records, birth and death certificates, old school photographs." For the next 2 hours, Abigail and Sarah combed through the society's records. They found several Edwards who would have been around the right age in 1908, but without more information, it was impossible to determine which one might be the boy in the photograph. "What about this?" Sarah said eventually, pointing to an entry in an old ledger. "Edward Blackwood, age 9 in 1908. There's a note here that he was the son of James Blackwood, who owned the bookshop on Main Street until the fire in 1912. A bookshop? Abigail felt a flutter of interest. The boy had been holding a book after all. "Do you have any more information about them?" Sarah shook her head. "Not much. The fire destroyed most of the town's records from that period. I know the Blackwood store was considered a bit unusual, though." "Unusual how?" "Well, from what I've heard, James Blackwood didn't sell the usual penny dreadfuls and classics that most bookshops carried. He specialized in rare books, old manuscripts, that sort of thing. Some folks thought he dealt in books about, well, things that decent people didn't discuss in those days." "You mean occult materials?" Abigail asked. Sarah nodded reluctantly. "That was the rumor. Nothing was ever proven, of course. Small towns love their gossip." "What happened to them, Edward and his father?" "Let me see." Sarah flipped through a few more pages. According to this, James Blackwood died in the fire that destroyed his shop. As for Edward, she ran her finger down the page and frowned. "That's strange. There's no death record for him, but no further mention of him in any town records either. It's as if he simply disappeared after the fire." Abigail felt another chill. "Is there anything else about the fire? Newspaper accounts, perhaps?" Sarah directed her to the Society's collection of newspaper microfilms. Abigail spent another hour scrolling through reports from 1912, finally finding a brief article about the fire. "Tragedy strikes Main Street," the headline read. "Bookshop fire claims life of proprietor." The article was short and vague, stating only that a fire had broken out in Blackwood's rare books late one evening in October 1912. James Blackwood's body had been found in the ruins, but the cause of the fire remained unknown. The article mentioned that James was survived by his son Edward, but provided no further details about the boy's whereabouts. A follow-up article a week later noted that investigators suspected arson, as the fire had started in multiple locations simultaneously, but no suspects had been identified. There was also mention of unusual items found in the ruins, materials of a disturbing nature, according to the town sheriff, but no specifics were provided. The final article Abigail found was dated a month after the fire. It briefly noted that the case remained unsolved and that Edward Blackwood had been placed in the care of a distant relative in another state. The boy's name never appeared in the town records again. By the time Abigail left the Historical Society, night had fallen. The streets were quiet, most shops closed for the evening. As she walked back to her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Twice she turned around, certain she would find someone following her, but each time the street behind her was empty. At home, she spread her notes on the kitchen table and studied what she had learned. Edward Blackwood, son of a bookseller who might have dealt in occult materials, a suspicious fire, a boy who disappeared from the records, and a strange figure reflected in that boy's eyes in a photograph taken 4 years before the fire. She opened her laptop and pulled up the digitized photograph again. Something about the book kept drawing her attention. The symbol on its cover. She zoomed in as far as the resolution would allow. The embossed design became clearer. A circle containing what appeared to be a many-pointed star, with smaller symbols positioned between the points. On impulse, she did an image search for occult symbol circle star, scrolling through dozens of results before stopping suddenly. There it was, a symbol almost identical to the one on the book, identified as the Seal of Azathoth, an occult symbol associated with ancient rituals meant to open doorways between worlds. Abigail wasn't superstitious. She had studied history long enough to know that humans had a rich tradition of creating mysterious symbols and attributing magical powers to them. But something about this particular connection made her uneasy. She continued researching, digging deeper into the history of occult bookshops in early 20th century New England. Such establishments had existed, catering to spiritualists and those interested in the growing occult movements of the time. Some had indeed specialized in rare and forbidden texts. Hours passed. Outside, a storm had begun, rain lashing against her windows. Abigail's eyes burned with fatigue, but she couldn't stop searching. She found mentions of a network of occult booksellers who had operated throughout New England in the early 1900s, secretly trading in texts that mainstream society considered dangerous or blasphemous. And then, in an obscure digital archive of occult studies, she found a name that made her heart skip: James Blackwood. He was mentioned in a researcher's notes as one of the foremost collectors and dealers of outer texts in the New England region before his untimely death in 1912. Outer texts. She searched the term and found it referred to a supposed collection of ancient books containing forbidden knowledge, often associated with entities from beyond normal reality. It was well past midnight when Abigail finally closed her laptop. Her head throbbed with all the information she had absorbed, much of it disturbing. The rational part of her mind insisted she was making connections that weren't really there, seeing patterns in coincidence. But another part, the part that had drawn her to history in the first place, with its mysteries and unanswered questions, whispered that she had stumbled onto something significant. She slept fitfully that night, her dreams filled with images of books with strange symbols, fires that burned without consuming, and a boy with ancient eyes who whispered words in a language she didn't understand, but somehow knew she should never repeat. Morning brought clarity and doubt. In the harsh light of day, Abigail's midnight researches seemed like the product of an overactive imagination. Yet when she returned to the archives and looked at the photograph of Edward again, the uneasiness returned. Those eyes, that book, the reflection. She decided to seek a second opinion. Daniel Wright, a professor in the university's photography department, was known for his expertise in analyzing historical photographs. She sent him an email with the digitized image attached, asking if he could help her authenticate the photograph and perhaps enhance some of the details. Daniel replied within the hour, asking her to bring the original to his office that afternoon. When she arrived, he was hunched over his computer, the digitized version of the photograph already displayed on his screen. "Fascinating image," he said, without looking up. "Definitely authentic for the period. The studio backdrop, the clothing, the posture, all consistent with portrait photography from around 1908. He glanced up at her. "Where did you find it?" "In a recently donated collection. It caught my eye because of the book the boy is holding." Daniel nodded. "Yes, unusual for a child to be photographed with a book, unless it had some significance. Usually they'd have a toy or nothing at all." He zoomed in on the book. No visible title, but there's definitely some kind of embossed design on the cover. "What about the reflection in his eye?" Abigail asked, trying to sound casual. I noticed something strange when I magnified that section. Daniel zoomed in on the boy's face, then further onto his right eye. Huh, he said after a moment. That's interesting. You see it too? The figure? There's definitely something reflected there. Could be the photographer, though the proportions seem off. He adjusted some settings, enhancing the contrast and clarity. Let me try something else. He worked with the image for several minutes, using techniques Abigail wasn't familiar with. Finally, he sat back. Take a look at this, he said. The enhanced image of the reflection was clearer now. The figure behind the camera was unnaturally tall and thin, its proportions wrong for a human body. Its face, if it could be called that, appeared to be covered by something dark, with vertical slits where eyes should be. What do you think it is? Abigail asked, her mouth suddenly dry. Daniel shook his head. Could be anything. An artifact in the original photograph, a peculiarity of the lighting, someone wearing unusual clothing. Photography from this period is full of anomalies. But his voice lacked conviction, and Abigail noticed he couldn't seem to look directly at the enhanced image for very long. Would you mind sending me these enhancements? She asked. Already done, he said, closing the image on his screen with what seemed like relief. Sent them to your university email. Fascinating photograph, Dr. Foster. Let me know if you find out more about its origin. As Abigail left his office, she couldn't help feeling that Daniel had been as disturbed by the image as she was, despite his professional detachment. Back in the archives, she opened the enhanced images Daniel had sent her. The figure in the reflection was even more unsettling now that she could see it more clearly. There was something fundamentally wrong about its proportions, the way it seemed to bend at impossible angles. And those eyes, dark slits that seemed to stare directly out of the photograph, as if seeing her across the century that separated them. She printed the enhanced image and added it to her growing file on Edward Blackwood and the photograph. Then she returned to her research, determined to find out what had happened to the boy after he disappeared from the town records. Over the next few days, Abigail reached out to historical societies and archives in neighboring states, inquiring about records of an Edward Blackwood who might have arrived in their communities around 1912 to 1913. Most responses were negative, but a librarian in a small town in Vermont sent her a promising lead, a school enrollment record for an Edward B. who had arrived in 1913 in the care of a guardian named Robert Hayes. Further digging revealed that Robert Hayes had been a distant cousin of James Blackwood's late wife. Hayes was described in local records as a solitary man of scholarly pursuits who lived on the outskirts of town. He and Edward had apparently kept to themselves, with Hayes homeschooling the boy rather than sending him to the local school after the first year. A newspaper article from 1920 mentioned Hayes briefly, noting that he had contributed a substantial collection of books on esoteric subjects to a private library in Boston upon his death. The article also mentioned that his ward, Edward, then about 21 years old, had inherited his property but had not been seen in town for some time. And there the trail went cold again. Abigail found no further records of Edward Blackwood, no marriage certificate, no property records, no death certificate. It was as if he had vanished for a second time. Meanwhile, her dreams about the boy had become more frequent and more disturbing. In each dream, he stood a little closer to her bed, the book in his hands now open, his mouth forming words she could almost, but not quite, hear. She would wake suddenly, always at 3:17 a.m., her heart pounding, her body drenched in sweat. After a week of disrupted sleep, Abigail decided to visit the site where Blackwood's bookshop had once stood. The address she had found in the old records now belonged to a coffee shop. Nothing remained of the original building. The entire block had been rebuilt multiple times over the century since the fire. As she sipped her coffee at a corner table, Abigail tried to imagine the space as it had been, shelves lined with rare books, perhaps hidden sections containing texts that most booksellers wouldn't touch. Had young Edward spent his days here, surrounded by these books? Had he read them? Had he understood what they contained? "Excuse me," she said to the barista as she was leaving. "Do you know if this building has any, unusual history?" The young woman looked blank. "You mean like ghosts or something?" "Not that I've noticed. But Jen, she works evenings. She says sometimes the lights flicker for no reason, especially in the back room where we keep supplies. That used to be an alley between buildings, she says." "Why?" Just curious about the history of the town, Abigail replied with a smile. I'm a researcher at the university. Oh, cool. Well, if you want weird history, you should talk to old Pete at the hardware store down the street. His family's been here forever, and he knows all kinds of stories about the town. Abigail thanked her and headed to the hardware store. It was a dusty, cluttered place that seemed out of step with the trendy boutiques and cafes that had taken over most of Main Street. Behind the counter stood a man who had to be Old Pete, white-haired, stooped, with hands gnarled from decades of manual work. Can I help you find something? He asked as she approached. Actually, I'm doing research on the history of the town, Abigail explained. Specifically, I'm interested in a bookshop that used to be on this block, owned by a man named James Blackwood. The barista at the coffee shop thought you might know something about it. Pete's friendly expression changed, his eyes narrowing slightly. Why would you be looking into that old business? That was before even my time, and I'm pushing 80. I found a photograph of his son, Edward, and I'm trying to piece together what happened to him after his father died in the fire. Pete was silent for a long moment, his gaze assessing her. Finally, he said, "Wait here," and disappeared into a back room. When he returned, he was carrying an old, worn, leather-bound book. My grandfather kept a journal, he said, placing the book on the counter. He didn't write much, but he mentioned the Blackwoods a few times. He was on the volunteer fire brigade that responded to the shop fire. He opened the book carefully, turning yellowed pages until he found what he was looking for. Here. The entry was brief, written in a cramped, uneven hand. October 17th, 1912. Responded to fire at Blackwood's shop. Too late to save much. Found James dead inside, but not from smoke or fire. His throat was cut. Sheriff says to keep quiet about it. Says the boy did it, but I don't believe it. Saw the boy watching from across the street, holding that book James always kept locked up. Boy's eyes weren't right. Not right at all. Abigail felt a chill run through her. The official report said James died in the fire. Pete nodded. That's what they told everyone. Small town, you understand. Some things people didn't want getting out. And the boy, Edward? According to my grandfather, they were going to take him in for questioning the next day, but he was gone. Some relative from out of state came and got him overnight. People talked about it for years afterward. Some said the boy was wrong somehow, that he knew things no child should know. Pete closed the journal. My grandfather didn't believe in superstition, but he told my father never to say the Blackwood name after dark. Said it invited attention from things best left alone. Do you know anything about the book mentioned here? The one James kept locked up? Pete shook his head. Only that it wasn't like other books. My grandfather once said it was a door, not a book, whatever that means. He studied her face. You've seen it, haven't you? In that photograph you mentioned. Abigail nodded slowly. I think so. A book with a strange symbol on the cover. Then I'd be careful if I were you. Some doors are meant to stay closed. He pushed the journal toward her. Take this. I've got no use for old stories, and maybe it'll help with your research. Just be careful what you go looking for. Abigail thanked him and left with the journal, her mind racing. James Blackwood hadn't died in the fire. He had been murdered. And according to Pete's grandfather, Edward had been at the scene, watching, holding the very book that was in the photograph. That night, Abigail carefully read through the entire journal. Most entries were mundane. Notes about the weather, work on the family farm, local gossip. But there were a few more mentions of the Blackwoods. One entry from 1910 described James Blackwood as not quite right in the head, and mentioned that he had recently returned from a trip to Europe with a trunk full of books that no God-fearing person would want to touch. Another entry from early 1912 mentioned that Edward Blackwood had stopped attending school, and that there were rumors the boy was helping his father with experiments that no Christian should be conducting. The final mention, dated a week after the fire, simply stated, Sheriff closed the case, says James killed himself after setting the fire, but nobody believes it. Too many strange things found in the ruins. Some books weren't burned at all, even though everything around them was ash. Men from Boston came and took them away. Abigail closed the journal, her thoughts churning. What kind of books wouldn't burn in a fire that reduced a building to ashes? What experiments had James been conducting with his young son? And what had happened to Edward after he disappeared from the town? She opened her laptop and pulled up the photograph again, staring at Edward's solemn face. The The book clutched tightly in his hands, the strange reflection in his eye. There was something deeply unsettling about the image, something that went beyond the normal discomfort of looking at old photographs. It was nearly midnight when Abigail finally went to bed, the journal and her notes piled on her nightstand. She had sent emails to several rare book experts, inquiring about the symbol on the book and the photograph and any texts it might be associated with. That night, her dream changed. Edward stood beside her bed, closer than ever before, the book open in his hands. This time she could hear his voice, a child's voice but with an unchildlike cadence, reciting words in a language that seemed to twist in her ears. "He is coming," Edward said suddenly in English, looking directly at her. "He's always been coming. The door is opening." Abigail tried to speak, to ask who was coming, but found herself paralyzed. Edward smiled, a terrible, knowing smile that didn't belong on a child's face. "You found me," he said. "Now I've found you." The book in his hands began to glow, the symbol on its cover burning with a cold light. The pages turned by themselves, faster and faster, and something began to emerge from between them. Something tall and thin, with proportions that hurt her eyes to look at. Abigail woke with a gasp, her body rigid with fear. The clock on her nightstand read 3:17 a.m. But something was different this time. The air in her bedroom felt thick, charged with a strange energy, and there was a smell she didn't recognize, like ozone and something organic, something rotting. She turned on her lamp with a shaking hand. The room appeared normal, empty, except for her, but as her eyes adjusted to the light, she noticed something on her bedroom wall opposite the bed, a dark stain that hadn't been there when she went to sleep. Heart-pounding, she got out of bed and approached the wall. The stain was roughly circular, about the size of a dinner plate, and seemed to be seeping from within the wall itself. In the center of the circle was a pattern of lines that looked disturbingly like the symbol she had seen on the book and the photograph. Abigail backed away, her mind racing. This couldn't be real. She was still dreaming, or the stress of her research had caused her to hallucinate. She closed her eyes, counted to 10, and looked again. The stain was still there. As she watched, it seemed to pulse slightly, as if something behind the wall was pushing against it. She fled the room, slamming the door behind her. In her living room, she turned on all the lights and sat on the couch, wrapping a throw blanket around her shoulders. She didn't return to her bedroom that night. In the morning, the stain was gone. The wall was clean, unmarked, as if nothing had happened. Abigail touched it cautiously, finding it solid and dry. Had she imagined the whole thing? Was she working too hard, letting her research affect her mental state? She called in sick to work, then spent the day trying to distract herself with mundane tasks: laundry, grocery shopping, cleaning the kitchen. But her thoughts kept returning to Edward Blackwood, the book, and the strange figure reflected in his eye. By evening, she had convinced herself that she needed a break from her research. It was affecting her too deeply, causing her to see things that weren't there. She would set it aside for a few days, focus on other projects, get some proper rest. She was preparing dinner when her phone chimed with an email notification. It was from Dr. Eliza Werner, a specialist in rare books whom Abigail had contacted about the symbol on the book in the photograph. "Dr. Foster," the email began, "I was intrigued by your inquiry about the symbol you described. Based on the image you sent, I believe what you're looking at is the seal of the watching eye, associated with a text called The Book of Doors. This is an extremely rare volume, with only 3 known copies in existence, one in a private collection in France, one in the restricted section of the British Library, and one that was allegedly destroyed in a fire in New England in the early 20th century. The book is written in a language that has never been fully translated, but scholars who have studied it believe it contains rituals meant to open pathways to other dimensions or realities. The most disturbing aspect of the text is the claim, made by several who have handled it, that the book itself is somehow alive or aware, that it watches those who possess it. I should warn you that there is a dark history associated with this text. Many of its owners have met with unusual or violent ends, and there are persistent rumors that the book cannot be destroyed by normal means. The copy that was supposedly burned in the New England fire was reportedly found intact among the ashes. If you've come across information about this book, I would advise extreme caution. Some texts are better left unstudied. Please let me know if you need further information. though I must say I'm reluctant to delve too deeply into this particular subject. Abigail read the email twice, her dinner forgotten. The Book of Doors, a text that couldn't be destroyed by fire, a book that watched its owners. The pieces were coming together, forming a picture that she didn't want to see but couldn't look away from. James Blackwood had somehow acquired this rare, dangerous book. His son Edward had been photographed holding it. 4 years later, James was dead, murdered, not killed in the fire as the official reports claimed, and Edward had disappeared, only to resurface briefly in Vermont before vanishing again. And now, over a century later, Abigail had found the photograph, zoomed in on the book, discovered the reflection in the boy's eye, and something had noticed her noticing. The room suddenly felt colder. Abigail wrapped her arms around herself, trying to shake off the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced around her kitchen, half expecting to see another stain forming on the wall, but everything appeared normal. She tried to approach the situation rationally. Even if the Book of Doors was real, even if it had some kind of unusual properties, it was just a book, and Edward Blackwood, if he had still been alive, would have been well over 100 years old. Whatever had happened in 1912 was long over, consigned to history like countless other tragedies and mysteries. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that by finding the photograph, by zooming in on that detail in the boy's eye, she had somehow connected herself to events that had never truly ended. She replied to Dr. Werner, thanking her for the information and asking if she knew of any other researchers who had studied the Book of Doors. Then she forced herself to eat something, took a long shower, and prepared for bed, deliberately avoiding looking at the wall where the stain had appeared. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her. She lay awake, listening to the sounds of her apartment, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional car passing outside, the creaking of the building settling. Normal sounds, comforting in their mundanity, until she heard something else, a soft rustling, like pages turning. Abigail froze, straining her ears. The sound came again from the direction of her home office. Slowly, she got out of bed and crept down the hallway. Her office door was ajar, a slice of darkness visible through the gap. She had closed it earlier, she was sure of it. Heart pounding, she pushed it open. The room was dark except for the glow of her computer screen, which should have been off. On the screen was the photograph of Edward, but something was different. The boy's eyes were looking directly at her, though she knew they had been focused slightly to the side in the original image. And the book in his hands was open. Abigail backed away, her breath coming in short gasps. This wasn't possible. Photographs didn't change. She was hallucinating, or dreaming, or... A notification sound from her computer made her jump. A new email had arrived. From her position in the doorway, she could see it was from an address she didn't recognize. EdwardBlackwoodMail.com. The subject line read, "You opened the door." Panic surged through her. She slammed the office door shut and ran back to her bedroom, grabbing her phone to call. Who? What would she say? That she was being haunted by a century-old photograph? That a boy who would be long dead was sending her emails? She sank onto her bed, trying to calm her racing thoughts. There had to be a rational explanation. Maybe she had fallen asleep at her computer and was dreaming all this. Or perhaps someone was playing an elaborate prank on her. Daniel from the photography department, or someone else who knew about her research. But deep down, she knew better. She had stumbled onto something real, something dangerous. By studying the photograph, by seeking out information about Edward Blackwood and the Book of Doors, she had drawn attention to herself. Attention from something that had been waiting, watching, for a very long time. The wall opposite her bed began to darken, the stain reappearing, larger this time, spreading outward like ink soaking into paper. In its center, the symbol from the book glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. And then the wall began to open. It wasn't a physical opening. The wall didn't crack or break. Instead, it seemed to become less solid, less real, the boundaries between wall and not wall blurring. Through this impossible opening, Abigail glimpsed something that her mind couldn't properly process. A vast, churning darkness filled with shapes that moved in ways that nothing in our reality should move. And standing at the threshold, silhouetted against that mind-bending darkness, was a boy holding a book. Edward looked exactly as he had in the photograph, solemn-faced, formally dressed, his hair neatly parted. But his eyes were wrong, filled with a cold light that no human eyes should contain. "You found me," he said, his voice the same childish yet not voice from her dream. "You looked where you shouldn't have looked. You saw what was hidden." Abigail tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her body felt frozen in place, unable to flee from the impossible sight before her. The boy, Edward, took a step forward, passing through the knot opening in her wall as if crossing a threshold from one room to another. "Do you know what happens to people who look too closely?" he asked, his voice still calm, conversational even. "They see, and once you see, you can't unsee. Once you're seen, you can't be unseen." He held up the book, and Abigail recognized it immediately, the dark leather binding, the embossed symbol on its cover. The Book of Doors. "It's not really a book," Edward said, as if reading her thoughts. "It's a key, a map, a gateway." He smiled, and there was something ancient and terrible in that smile. Father didn't understand that at first. He thought he could study it, control it. He didn't realize it was studying him. Edward took another step toward her bed. Despite his small stature, he seemed to fill the room with his presence, as if something much larger was wearing the shape of a child. "The book chose me," he continued, "just as it chose you." "I don't understand," Abigail finally managed to whisper. "What do you want from me?" Edward tilted his head, considering her question. "Want? Nothing. The book wants. It's always wanting, always hungry, always watching." He glanced down at the volume in his hands. "It needs a keeper. I've been its keeper for a very long time now. But even I have limits." The darkness behind him seemed to pulse, reaching tendrils into her bedroom. Where they touched, the floor, the walls, her dresser, things seemed to warp and twist, becoming slightly wrong versions of themselves. "What happened to your father?" Abigail asked, desperate to keep him talking, to delay whatever was coming. Edward's expression darkened. He tried to close the door. After he saw what came through, he was afraid. He thought destroying the book would end it. The boy laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You can't destroy a door by burning it. You can only open it wider." "And you killed him?" The words felt ridiculous even as she said them. How could this child have murdered his father over a century ago? Yet she knew somehow that it was true. "I protected the book," Edward corrected her. "As was my duty, as will be yours." A chill ran through Abigail. "What do you mean?" Edward stepped closer until he was standing at the foot of her bed. This close, she could see that there was something wrong with his substance. He wasn't quite solid, his edges blurring slightly, as if he existed partially in another reality. "Time doesn't matter to the book," he said, "or to what lives beyond the door. But this form—" He looked down at his childish body with distaste. "It has limitations. It wears thin after a while. The book needs a new keeper." His eyes, ancient and cold, fixed on hers. "It has chosen you." "No," Abigail said, finding her voice at last. "I don't want any part of this. Whatever this is, whatever you are, leave me alone." Edward smiled again, patient and terrible. "It's already too late. You opened the way when you looked too closely, when you saw the watcher in my eye." He held out the book. "Take it. Accept it, or it will take from you anyway, and that path is less pleasant." The book seemed to pulse in his hands, the symbol on its cover glowing with that same cold light that filled Edward's eyes. Abigail felt a pull toward it, as if invisible threads were connecting her to the ancient volume, tugging her forward. "This isn't real," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "This can't be happening." "Reality is more fragile than you think," Edward replied, "especially now, when the stars are right again. Just as they were in 1908, when the book first came to this town. Just as they will be again in another cycle." He extended the book toward her. "Take it. Learn from it. Become its voice in this world." Abigail's hands moved without her conscious direction, reaching for the book. She tried to stop herself, but it was as if her body no longer belonged to her. Her fingers brushed against the leather cover. The moment she touched it, something rushed through her. A flood of images, sensations, knowledge that no human mind was meant to contain. She saw vast, impossible spaces between the stars. She saw creatures of darkness and void that had existed before Earth had formed. She saw doorways opening between worlds, releasing things that should never have been freed. And she saw Edward, not as the boy who stood before her, but as he truly was, a human shell filled with something ancient and patient and hungry. She tried to pull her hands away from the book, but they wouldn't obey. Instead, they closed around it, taking it from Edward's grasp. The moment it passed to her, she felt a change, a coldness spreading through her body, starting from her hands and moving inward, as if the book was rewriting her from the outside in. Edward stepped back, and for the first time, she saw relief on his face, an all-too-human expression that seemed out of place after the otherworldly presence he had projected. "It's yours now," he said, his voice suddenly younger, more childlike. "The burden passes to you." He looked over his shoulder at the darkness that still churned where her wall should have been. "They'll speak to you soon. They'll show you what they need." "Who?" Abigail managed to ask, even as the cold spread through her chest, her neck, creeping toward her mind. "The Watchers. The ones who wait beyond the door. The ones who have always been watching." Edward's form was becoming less substantial, fading like mist in morning sunlight. "They need eyes in this world. They need hands. They need voices. Please," Abigail begged, though she wasn't sure what she was pleading for. Help, understanding, mercy. Edward was barely visible now, little more than an outline against the darkness. "Look for the others," he said, his voice fading with his form. "The ones who came before you, the ones who will come after. We are all keepers of the door." And then he was gone, leaving Abigail alone with the book in her hands and the impossible doorway still open in her wall. The cold had reached her mind now, bringing with it whispers in languages that had never been meant for human tongues. She wanted to throw the book away, to run from her apartment and never return, but her body wouldn't obey her commands. Instead, she found herself opening the book, her eyes scanning pages covered in symbols that shifted and changed as she looked at them, rearranging themselves into patterns that somehow, terribly, she could understand. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and gradually Abigail realized they were speaking to her, telling her what she needed to do next, how she would serve as the new keeper of the door. Outside her window, the sky was lightening with the approach of dawn, but inside her room, the darkness was growing deeper, spreading from the doorway in her wall, flowing around her like water, like ink, like the space between stars. She knew with a certainty that transcended fear, that when the darkness receded, she would no longer be entirely herself. Something else would share her mind, her body, something that had waited a very long time for a new vessel. The Book of Doors had found a new keeper. 3 months later, Professor Daniel Wright sat in his office, studying a new collection of photographs that had been donated to the university. Most were typical early 20th century portraits and landscapes, but one had caught his attention, a studio portrait of a young boy holding a book. There was something unsettling about the image, something in the boy's eyes that seemed too knowing, too adult. On impulse, Daniel scanned the photograph and zoomed in on the reflection in the boy's eye. There, barely visible, was the silhouette of a tall, thin figure standing behind the camera. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He had seen something like this before, in a photograph that Dr. Abigail Foster had brought to him several months ago, before her mysterious disappearance. The police investigation had turned up nothing. Abigail had simply vanished, leaving behind her apartment with all her belongings untouched. The only unusual element had been a dark stain on her bedroom wall, which investigators had attributed to water damage. Daniel had been questioned, of course, as one of the last people to see her. He had mentioned the photograph she had shown him, her interest in the boy and the book he held, but the photograph hadn't been found among her possessions, and without it, his story had seemed like a strange tangent in an already puzzling case. Now, staring at this new yet eerily similar photograph, Daniel felt a growing unease. He zoomed in further on the boy's face, studying his features. Then he pulled up the university directory on his computer and searched for Abigail Foster. Her faculty profile appeared on his screen, a smiling woman in her late 30s with auburn hair and glasses. He had known her casually for years, had always found her to be a sensible, level-headed person, not the type to simply disappear without a trace. On impulse, he zoomed in on her eyes in the profile picture. For a moment, he thought he saw something reflected there, a tall, thin shape watching. His phone chimed with an email notification. The sender's address made his blood run cold, abigail.fostermail.com. The subject line read, "I found something you should see." Daniel's cursor hovered over the email, his instinct warning him not to open it. But curiosity, the same curiosity that had drawn him to photography, to uncovering the hidden details in images, won out. The email contained only a short message. "I've discovered something remarkable about the photograph I showed you. Could you meet me in the archives tonight at 8? I'll be working late." It was signed simply A. Daniel checked the time, 7:30 p.m. The archives would be nearly empty by now, most staff and students having gone home for the day. He should call the police. This could be a lead in Abigail's disappearance, or it could be someone's sick idea of a joke, or it could be Abigail herself, returned from wherever she had been. Daniel closed his laptop, tucked it into his bag, and headed for the door. Whatever waited for him in the archives, he needed to see for himself. As he left his office, he didn't notice the photograph on his desk, the boy with the book, or the way the boy's eyes seemed to follow him as he walked away. In the darkened archives, something waited. Something that had once been Abigail Foster, but was now a keeper of the door. Something that held a book bound in dark leather, with a strange symbol embossed on its cover. And as Daniel approached the archives building, its pages turned, preparing to welcome another set of eyes that had looked too closely, another mind that had seen what was hidden. The Book of Doors was always hungry for new keepers,